Hello everybody, Vincent Venturella here. Just wanted to take some more time to return to ninth edition and A Tale of Two Changes. Last time in the video when we talked about this, I focused a lot on the sort of mechanical changes, the changes to the game, stuff like that. This time when I talk about it, I want to talk more about the story, because I think those are really the two changes, the mechanics and the story. And when in talking to others like Matiram over time about the sort of trepidations around this change, a lot of people list the fluff or the story as the change and being a very significant event. It doesn't have a good parallel in the history of games and such. And I wanted to take a moment to sort of talk about that. And because in the history of fantasy miniature wargaming, there really isn't any changes that are exactly like this, where you blow up a world and or redo it, you have this major sort of thing. But sort of retcons, reboots, reissues, whatever you want to say, that sort of thing is actually quite common across other media. And so I want to examine it today through the lens of two other kinds of things: comics and role-playing games, both of which have been around for a longer time than fantasy miniature wargaming, and so have had occasion to do this. Now, I should note that mini wargaming itself has been around a lot longer than role-playing games, but the trick was most of it was historical wargaming, and historical wargaming has no need to do this, right? You can't, like, whatever happened with Napoleon happened. You can't go back and retcon that story. It's history. You can do an alternate battle or something like that, but it doesn't change the underlying history. It's still always sitting there. So let's start with comics. So if you're an avid reader of comics, you probably know that comics have been around for a long time. The first superhero comics came about in the late 1930s. As a result, they've had to change many times, and both of the big current publishing houses, DC and Marvel, have done major revisions, reboots, complete reconstitutions of their universe. So let's start with DC. Let's just talk about DC for a little while, because they've really done it in two interesting ways. And the first thing I want to talk about is what happened back in the mid-'80s in a chain of books called Crisis on Infinite Earths. At the time, that point in the mid-'80s, DCU had become very big and bloated. There was a lot of detritus. Heroes had become very powerful, and it was hard for new people to get into reading comics. And so DC made this bold move to do Crisis on Infinite Earths. And it was one of the first times this kind of thing had really been done. Not truly the first, but the first on that scale, let's say. And what they did is they took all of their many multitude of worlds and collapsed them down into one. Heroes died, and entire characters were written out and collapsed together and brought onto certain worlds, and lots of things changed. It was a very apocalyptic event. And if you just say Google image search Crisis on Infinite Earths, you'll see that the pictures that come up don't exactly look happy. It was, it was a big deal. In the end, it was a very successful change, and that's what I want to think about when we talk about these. Why were these changes successful or not, and what does that mean for Warhammer and 9th edition? Well, in this case, this change was pretty successful. I think most people still regard Crisis on Infinite Earths, even today, as an amazing story. And why was it successful? Well, on the other side of it, the characters that were around still felt and acted pretty much like the characters that were there before. The powers might have changed slightly, the power level might have changed slightly, but on the whole, Batman was still Batman, Superman was still Superman. Okay? So when people were reading a book afterward, they still felt like they knew what they were looking at. It wasn't a totally new experience. All right? What does that mean for Warhammer? Well, it means that the characters in the world need to either still exist or be the same or be recognizable as archetypes that we know. So we'll get more into it later, but there has to be some continuity there, right? when DC blew up their world on Crisis on Infinite Earths, they didn't just generate 100 new superheroes on the other side. Batman and Superman were still running around. Not every hero survived. Many died or changed or became a new person. So different Flash or something like that. But the archetypes were still there, and many of the characters were still there. Now DC would do this again later, about a generation later, so recently in the 2000s, mid 2000s, when they did the New 52. And the New 52 was, I think, to me, much more relevant to the change in Warhammer. In the New 52, they skinnied down basically their lists to these 52 launch titles. And it was particular heroes that they had focused on and wanted to really work on this tight core. Does that sound familiar? There's some rumors floating around about 9th edition. And by the way, one real quick note, when I'm talking about things in 9th, obviously this is all rumors, it's all hearsay, we don't know anything for sure, so we're taking all of this with a big grain of salt. I'm operating off of best guess and the information we have. And so they started with this skinny down list. And when they did that, what it allowed them to do is focus on those individual characters and really build them. But at the same time, it allowed them to then introduce and bring back in, somewhat quickly over the next couple years, other characters and reintroduce them in new ways, revise their stories, bring their backstories up with the times, and so on and so forth. So what does that mean for Warhammer? Well, we see the same thing here. They're trying to go to a skinny down list of available units product, i.e. what we play with in the world. There can be other units and things that are in the world, it's just not necessarily available to the players. So, for example, for a long time we hear about armies in the Border Princes, during 8th edition, but there wasn't really an official Border Princes book. Yeah, there might have been fan-made stuff or whatever, but there is the idea that there are many armies in the Warhammer world that we don't necessarily have access to play, and so too is it here. While at the same time, we can then introduce that new stuff over time, right? And we've heard that with the frequent limited release, where they'll be able to introduce new units on a very frequent basis. Lots of armies will be getting new stuff to play with, new models to buy. So, that kind of thing. And so I think there's a parallel there. And I think it worked well for them. Hopefully, that aspect of the business will work well for Games Workshop and Warhammer as well. I mentioned the idea of sort of changing the story, in the backstory. And I think that gets to another interesting point of why in comics they often do this. An interesting aspect of comic book characters is that they have a personality and they have an origin. They have sort of a backstory of what defines them and what makes them and who they are. And the problem is that that doesn't always stay the same. Because the generation, as time goes on, especially with comics, which have been around for so long, the generation doesn't always recognize the hero as something interesting. And the good heroes, the best heroes, change with the times. Okay? We tend to think of somebody like Batman as being like a particular person. He is a particular way. But that's just not true. Batman was invented in the late 30s, basically. Bob Kane created him. And at that time, he was a very sort of like two-fist, violent detective. He was mysterious and dark and such. And he was very violent in the beginning. Like, he shot people with guns and killed them. Okay, that did very quickly go away, but nonetheless, we don't think of modern Batman as doing that. But he was this very sort of dark, gritty detective. And